You're viewing the Parliament Channel 11, also broadcasting on 105.5 FM.
Good morning to members of the public tuned in on Parliament Channel 11 and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, and also on our YouTube channel, ParlView. We also say a special good morning to members of the media gathered here with us at the J. Hamilton Maurice Room of the Parliament. We are gathered here today for this press conference, which is being held to update the media and by extension the wider public on 3 reports that have been done by the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises. Those reports are the 4th report of the JSC on state enterprises on an inquiry into the operations and administration of the Vehicle Management Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, or VIMCOT, with specific focus on the repair and acquisition of vehicles for state bodies. The 2nd report is the 5th report of the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises on an inquiry into the administration and operations of Caribbean Airlines Limited. And the 3rd report is the 6th report of the JSC on State Enterprises on an inquiry into the borrowing practices of state enterprises with an emphasis on regulation of borrowing, purposes for borrowed funds, and sustainability of debt servicing ratios. My name is Atiba Wilshire, and I'll be the moderator for the press conference today. It is my duty now to introduce the members of the JSC and State Enterprises who are with us here today. I'll begin with the chairman, who's seated at the center, Mr. David Small. To Mr. Small's left is committee member, Brigadier General retired Ansel Antwine. To Mr. Antine's left is committee member Wade Mark. To the chairman's right is committee member Fazal Karim, and to Mr. Karim's right is committee member Mr. Adrian Leons. At this time, I'll hand over to the chairman of the committee to first give a little overview of the mandate of the committee before we get into the matters set before us. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilshire. Good morning, members of the media, fellow committee members, and the listening, viewing, and streaming members of the public. I am, as Mr. Wilshire indicated, I'm David Small, Senator, Chairman of the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises. The mandate of this committee is, this committee was appointed to pursuant to the directive encapsulated at Section 66A of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The mandate of this committee is to inquire and to report to the Parliament on state enterprises falling under the purview of this committee. The areas of the focus relative to state enterprises are 1, their administration, 2, the manner and exercise of their powers, 3, their methods and functioning, and 4, any criteria adopted by them in the exercise of their powers. You would have already been introduced to the members of the committee who are present. I'd like to just inform you that the other members of the committee who are unavoidably absent today are Dr. Lester Henry, who's the vice chairman, Mrs. Sherry-Ann Critchlow-Coburn, and Mrs. Alison Bash. The purpose of this press conference is to bring the media and the public up to date on the most recent work of the committee, and I will now go straight into addressing the committee's 4th report on the 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the operations and administration of the Vehicle Management Company of Trinidad and Tobago, VIMCOT. It's important to know that when the committee looked at VIMCOT, I think, or in fact on any entity, the mandate of this committee is to try to see how we can help and assist these organizations to improve their performance and be able to generate appropriate returns to the shareholder. That is the mandate of this committee. That's what we look to try to do, to improve ways that we can inquire into the activity, see what works, see what doesn't work, suggest changes so that we can find ways to make these entities appear and be responsible for the monies that they are charged to manage. And the chairman is stepping out of the script here, because I think part of the challenge this committee has recognized is that I think that some of these state entities don't understand or don't fully accept that they are in charge of state funds. They are merely the custodians. They are the custodians of state funds, and they are responsible and accountable to everyone, every single person who's in this room and who's outside of this room. And there should be no difficulty with that. So that I want to go into the summary of the VIMCOT report. The report examined the operations and operations of VIMCOT. We focus on some of the current or present issues facing the company. When we looked at the company's balance sheet and its annual drawdown on the revenue of the state, we recognized that the company was struggling to achieve its mandate. I think that inside of the numbers we looked at, the company's business in terms of revenue had fallen off by over 70% in a period of 5 to 6 years. So the company is struggling. And the reason it was struggling is that its operational costs didn't change. So that when you have your revenue falling by almost 3/4, but your operating costs remain the same, then you will always have, any business will struggle in that environment. And I think that where we are, we really appreciated from VIMCOT in particular that they were very, very responsive to all our requests for information. They demonstrated the type of accuracy that we expect from a state enterprise. Every request for information was met fully, comprehensively, probably too much paper. But as a committee, I wanted to put that on the record that VIMCOT were very, very forthcoming, because they understood their circumstances and they understood their role to account. So now I will now invite member Antoine to appraise the media of the findings of this committee on VIMCOT.
Thank you. The general findings are as follows. 1, based on the evidence provided, the committee believes that VIMCOT has fallen short of the recommended best practices that should be guiding its operations. 2, having reviewed the submissions received from VIMCOT, the committee became cognizant of the magnitude of the challenge that VIMCOT faces. 3, in addition, the committee was not satisfied that truly viable solutions were being considered by the company. 4, in light of the potential of the income stream from CNG conversion of public sector vehicles, the committee is hopeful that CNG conversion will propel VIMCOT to a state of profitability. 5, based on evidence provided, the committee was concerned about the following. A, that VIMCOT staff costs were found to be unsustainable and will erode attempts to achieve a state of profitability. B, that staff have not been prepared for implementation of Public Procurement and Dispersal of Public Property Act 2015, particularly in light of current unsatisfactory procurement practices as revealed by the internal audit. And 6, despite VIMCOT's confidence that sufficient self-sufficiency would be attained in 2020, the committee remains doubtful in the light of the evidence provided. I now pass on to committee member Adrian Leons to give the summary of recommendations.
Thank you, member. The summary of recommendations is as follows. VIMCOT should immediately implement the recommendations outlined in the Internal Audit Management Action Plan 2014 to 2017. In particular, the recommendations to relaunch the standard operating procedures. In light of the profitability of the car wash facility in San Fernando, VIMCOT should proceed with a feasibility study to establish additional car wash facilities at operation centers. VIMCOT should investigate the additional options for product and service diversification as identified in written submissions dated 6th of March 2017. VIMCOT should investigate the possibility of attaining certification as an approved center to certify those mechanics and technicians in Trinidad and Tobago who may have knowledge, skills, and competencies, but no certification. VIMCOT should conduct an analysis of its key strengths that may provide a competitive advantage in market and opportunities that may be exploited. VIMCOT should negotiate a partnership with National Energy Skills Center, NESC, while they await approval from the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, with a view to immediately commence CNG conversion. VIMCOT should conduct a manpower audit with the objective of reducing staff costs to a level that is more in line with operational capacity. VIMCOT should provide training for all staff on standard operating procedures and use the Tranman calendar schedule as contained in the Internal Audit Management Action Plan 2014 to 2017. VIMCOT should maintain open lines of communications with its line ministries to lobby full support in the areas of accounts receivable and approval for CNG conversion. VIMCOT should conduct procurement training with a view to prepare staff for the full implementation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015. VIMCOT should immediately take all necessary steps to reduce cost, as well as pursue all avenues for gaining the support of relevant ministries in aid of enforcing compliance with VIMCOT's mandate as a public service. Designed to efficiently and effectively undertake vehicle maintenance on a centralized basis, which is part of VIMCOT's Corporate Business Plan 2014 to 2018.
Thank you very much, MP Leons.
No problem.
I will now address, and for the purposes of the meeting, we will take questions on all the various entities and the reports at the end of the process. I will now address the committee's fifth report for the 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the borrowing practices of state enterprises, with an emphasis on regulation of borrowing, purposes for borrowed funds, and sustainability of debt servicing ratios. The report examined the borrowing practices of state enterprises with an emphasis on regulation for borrowing and other areas. Focus was given to the quantum of state enterprise debt and the sustainability of current debt obligations and the mechanisms in place to monitor and evaluate the state enterprises that have borrowed funds. We're all aware of the current economic situation of the country and the current debt profile of the country, and what is often not picked up is the fact that a lot of the state sector debt is not necessarily officially on the books. So that was one of the reasons that the committee wanted to understand what additional debt is there out there, and what was that debt contracted for? What did you use the money for? What was the reason there for going into these various types of borrowings? So that we've provided quite a comprehensive analysis of what was given. And again, I want to put on the record the committee's appreciation for the efforts of the Ministry of Finance, who represented that they came to the inquiry. They provided all the information that the committee requested and provided additional oral evidence to help us to be able to come to some very clear conclusions and recommendations on this matter. And again, I want to put that on the record because I think that we've had challenges in the past. I expect probably we may have some challenges going forward, but I want to say that the Ministry of Finance team did a stellar job in comment to us and providing the information that the committee requested. I will now invite Senator Mark to appraise the media with the findings and recommendations of this committee on this inquiry. Senator Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to members of the media. The issue surrounding the borrowing practices of state enterprises is extremely critical and important, particularly when account is taken of the fact that there are some 54 state enterprises, 47 fully owned by the people of Trinidad and Tobago, 7 of them majority owned, and some 63 indirectly owned. So you're talking about more than 100 state enterprises, fully, majority, minority, indirectly owned by the people of Trinidad and Tobago. As the chairman said, this question of borrowing is of grave concern because sometimes you do not find on the books these contingency liabilities arising, and sometimes you have to dig deeper. We were able to inquire into the borrowing practices and the reason why they were borrowing monies, that is the state enterprises, and the sustainability of these enterprises to service their debts when they contract them. Several key findings were advanced after we concluded our inquiry. Firstly, we discovered that the state enterprise government guaranteed debt, which is an act of Parliament and has a ceiling of $45 billion, stood at $19 billion, while non-government guaranteed debt, that is state enterprises that are able to stand on their own strength, stood at $25 billion, representing a total of some $44 billion in both government guaranteed and non-government guaranteed. We were also able to advance another critical finding, and that had to do with the fact that state enterprises with government guaranteed borrowing as well as non-government guaranteed borrowings did not use debt to revenue ratios for financial or debt management analysis. We can go into the technical terms as to what these ratios represent. Another finding had to do with the non-government guarantee loans. The Investments Division of the Ministry of Finance would examine the ability of the entity, state enterprise, to repay the loans using indicators such as debt to equity ratios, standard profitability, liquidity and debt servicing ratios, as well as the general trajectory of the loan. We were also able to observe as a finding that the debt to equity ratios, which indicated the level of risk being adopted by a state enterprise to finance growth, and in themselves did not give us an indication of the country, the benefits gained from such borrowings or such debt. It was understood that the benefit of the debt was gained if growth exceeded costs of borrowing, which is logical, and therefore some measure of growth versus cost of borrowing would be a key metric for the investment division to track. Another finding was companies that generated revenue and wished to borrow without a government guarantee were required to include a financial management strategy outlining their ability to service their requested borrowings, as well as an updated strategic plan. Another finding dealt with the companies, many of them we discovered, they borrowed without government guarantee on the strength of their balance sheet. However, several of these enterprises did not have updated strategic plans. So even though they were strong, their balance sheets were good, they did not submit to the Minister of Finance their strategic plans and their vision and direction for the company's future. We also discovered, as a key finding, many state enterprises were unable to pay their debt or pay their debt at the expense of their statutory obligations. There were many instances we discovered in the past when funds were borrowed by these state enterprises without the proper approval process. There were also instances where state enterprises strayed from their stated mandate with minimal repercussions, primarily because the state enterprises performance monitoring manual is not legally binding and does not have a penalty structure. And the final finding is that we learned as a committee that despite the role of the investments division, a lot of responsibility for the monitoring of state enterprise borrowing lay with the line ministry, which is the Ministry of Finance, in terms of ensuring that the money would be spent for the purpose given. The Ministry of Finance, through the reading of the board minutes, would of course secure some information, but that information would have been, on many occasions, dated. Let me provide you with some of our recommendations to address this situation. Because as you know, Trinidad and Tobago is inching closely to a total debt of $100 billion. And the state enterprise sector alone is 44 billion, as I have outlined. When I calculate that $70,000 has to be found by every man, woman, and child to meet this obligation. So the state enterprise sector is very critical in us ensuring that everything is done properly in the interest of efficiency in our country. So the recommendations that we have put forward are as follows. One, the investments division should implement mechanisms to track returns on investments in order to ensure that the benefits of debt acquired outweigh the costs. They must do serious cost benefits analysis. Secondly, the investment division should ensure that liquidity ratios are used to determine whether entities are able to cover debt obligations and be allowed acquire or to allow to acquire any additional debt. Number three, the investments division should immediately enforce a mandate to have the strategic plans of every state enterprise which borrows without government guarantee completed and submitted within 3 months of this report. Fourthly, the Ministry of Finance should ensure that there's an up-to-date strategic plan and that be made mandatory whenever processing loan applications to state enterprises. Fifthly, the Ministry of Finance should pursue avenues to give legal force and effect to the state enterprises performance monitoring manual, including the insertion and enforcement of a penalty structure. If you violate the rules, you must pay a penalty as a state enterprise. That is what we are advancing. Sixthly, as a recommendation, our committee is calling on the Investments Division to seek proper consideration and to ensure that proper consideration be given for this division to have representation on every state enterprise so that we can have a better monitoring of the behavior and the conduct of these enterprises, because many of them are rogue enterprises. And finally, the Ministry of Finance should urgently liaise with the Service Commissions Department regarding the staffing needs of the Investment Division, with the aim of filling all current vacancies within the shortest possible time frame. This is the final recommendation that we have submitted for the consideration of the State Enterprise Committee, and by extension, the country as a whole. Mr. Chairman, I turn over the proceedings to you.
Thank you much, Senator Mark. And I want to just wrap this up. This was particularly concerning to this committee. We have a system where enterprises are able to borrow. But here's the problem. Several of those enterprises are borrowing without any plan. Now, if you apply that to your normal living, you want to borrow money to do something, but you have no plan for what you're going to do with it. So how does that work? That just doesn't seem to make any sense to us. Perhaps there's something going on that we don't understand. But if you don't have a strategic plan, what is the basis for you borrowing? How can you outline or justify what you're going to use the money for? The other issue is that there's something called the Public Sector Performance Monitoring Manual. There's a whole series of guidelines and requirements for entities on a whole range of issues. Because we have an issue in state enterprises that the chairman independently has spoken about, where we have chairmen or boards of state enterprises, members of boards, have gone rogue. They're running their own show. Why? Because the performance monitoring manual is not mandatory. It is not binding. People look at it, it looks interesting, but they seem to want to run their own show. So the committee is of the view that the way, the manual is complete. It's very, very detailed, especially regards to borrowing, about the procedures you have to go through. What happens, our experience and the information we've received is that several entities essentially ignore that and go along the road. And that should not happen. So part of our recommendation is to make sure that that becomes, in some way, a binding document. And then the biggest challenge, the entity that is charged with monitoring state enterprises, the Investments Division, is woefully under-resourced. Woefully under-resourced. We have over 100 state entities under their purview, and they are woefully, it's impossible for them to manage these entities. So one of our recommendations, because what happens, boards of directors take decisions, and by the time the investment decision finds out, it comes back to the ministry via a copy of the minutes. It's weeks after the decision has already been taken. Post facto, you're almost stuck with what has been done. One of our recommendations is to make sure that we have the investment divisions have a member of its staff on the board, so that when the matter comes up for consideration on the board, the investments committee investment division, would have understood what was happening and would have been able to have a voice on the board to say yea or nay, or this is how we should do it. So I wanted to share that the committee went through a rigorous process we identified what we consider to be some systemic weaknesses in the way in which state enterprises borrow, and we've made recommendations to try to see how we can streamline that process, but put some rigor into that process. Right now, the rigor is not there. And because the rigor is not there, people get away or entities get away. Not that they're bad people. When a system is lax, bad things happen. That's just how it is. So I want to close on borrowing. I will now address the committee's report into the inquiry and into the administration and operations of Caribbean Airlines Limited. And I want to have an introductory comment. The committee, for your record, the previous entities, both in terms of the borrowing with Ministry of Finance and VIMCOT, we had one hearing, and that was more than enough to find all information and to help us to complete the inquiries. We had to meet with Caribbean Airlines 3 times. We met with them on January 9th, March 13th, and May 8th. And we received a number of submissions from Caribbean Airlines. And the committee is of the view that we had a struggle with Caribbean Airlines because Caribbean Airlines and the representatives that came here, we found that in the way in which they interacted with us, we had challenges with the way in which we requested information, we would get a partial submission. We had to literally tear the information out of Caribbean Airlines on particular issues. Some issues, they were very free to give the information. Others, we had to literally drag it out of them. It seems that there's a challenge with this entity asking questions about the way in which they manage the operations. And this committee was not having any of it. Because I recall Caribbean Airlines coming, and they are quoting about giving us a legal opinion and all sorts of things about submitting information. And the committee, this chairman, is not having any of that. Why should that entity 100% owned by the state be challenging the authority of the parliament? This committee simply refused to respond to that. So that I think that I wanted to preface my introduction because I think that it's important to understand that this committee had a hard time with Caribbean Airlines. We had a really, really, really tough time. And it's because when we started to get into the information, the things that we found were mind-boggling. The things that are happening, that some of these things that we're going to outline in the findings here should not be happening at a state-owned entity. Caribbean Airlines clearly does not understand that they are a state-owned entity. They are using state funds. Whatever money they earn belongs to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. They are merely the custodians, and they're not to take care of themselves in the way in which they've been taking care of themselves. Their duty is to take those funds and try to generate the best return for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So forgive the chairman for having to go into this lengthy introduction, but I think it is necessary to set the frame for the way in which we address this. So that, and given the volume of recommendations, we'll have several members, because we've had to group the recommendations, because there were just so many issues. So both myself and 2 other members will be sharing the recommendations on Caribbean Airlines. So I think that the report examined the operations of Caribbean Airlines. We looked at some of the long outstanding, but also the current issues facing the company. And we looked at the company's prolonged struggle to achieve profitability, along with its continued dependence on the state for subventions. And the report outlines CAL's current position and measures in what our current passes are, things that we think that could aid the company in trying to improve its operations so that it could be on a sustainable path to growth. And let me be clear, a lot of this work was done, but the management, or various parts of the management, or various members of management have chosen to ignore good recommendations that were made in the past. And all we're saying is there's no rocket science to running an airline. The airline business is a business that the model is changing, but you have to adapt your business model. You can't apply a business model that applied in the 80s and the 90s to where we are now. It just can't work. So now I would like to invite Member Karim to apprise the media of the findings of the committee, and he will introduce the full set of recommendations also. Member Karim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Caribbean Airlines, the national airline of Trinidad and Tobago, was incorporated in September of 2006 and began its commercial operations on the 1st of January 2007, which means that as we speak and as we're approaching the end of 2017, it basically would have been completing almost 11 years of its existence. The chairman indicated that there were 3 public hearings and 7 written submissions. And I think it's important for us to state that the officials who appeared before the inquiry with the Joint Select Committee comprise of Caribbean Airlines Limited, the officials from the Ministry of Finance, and also officials from the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority. The committee found, and I'm going to read now the general findings of the committee with respect to Caribbean Airlines Limited. The committee noted that Caribbean Airlines Limited has consistently failed to deliver to reporting timelines. This affected the ability of its line ministry, the Ministry of Finance, to adequately monitor and evaluate its operations. The committee noted that despite the issues experienced with customer services, Caribbean Airline Limited benefited from a level of brand loyalty that may be leveraged. The committee noted that the contents of the Lufthansa report were valuable and believed that the recommendations therein would steer CAL towards profitability. The committee further noted that the major issues with respect to Caribbean Airlines Limited's fleet surrounded the safety and reliability of aircraft and the upkeep of aircraft. The committee also noted that CAL was struggling to manage instances of fraud. The committee also noted that Caribbean Airlines Limited was owed a significant amount by the government of Venezuela and noted the burden that servicing the domestic air bridge had placed on CAL's profitability. The committee noted that CAL's human resource focus was skewed towards the pilots and members of management. It further noted that several positions in the organizational structure were filled by individuals who did not possess the required qualifications. The committee noted that Caribbean Airlines Limited had permitted excessive use of the flight jump seat by staff for personal travel. The committee noted that CAL failed to pay to the Board of Inland Revenue benefit in kind taxes due in connection to the jump seat flights by staff. We also noted that Caribbean Airlines Limited needed to conduct a manpower needs analysis in parallel with the route and flight rationalization exercise, and that CAL made efforts to recruit foreign pilots. This is what the committee also found, that Caribbean Airlines made efforts to recruit foreign pilots despite the oversupply of local pilots.
Good. I would like to interject here. That was something that particularly peeved this committee. Caribbean Airlines came before this committee and reported that they, in 2015, I believe, they went out to look for about 6 to 8 pilots, and they got over 100 applications. Yet on the very day that they were here on May the 8th for a hearing, there was an advertisement on a very public website called Direct Personnel. And here's the top line of the ad: "Come fly in the sunny Caribbean." Caribbean Airlines is advertising for pilots to come fly in the sunny Caribbean. And it's done on the same day when they appeared before this committee. I am not sure if it was just an accident of timing or it was deliberate. But we have enough there, lots of pilots that we're aware of who are qualified and trained, can't get a job at Caribbean Airlines. Why are they advertising internationally for pilots? So this was an issue that particularly peeved this committee when, by their own admission, when they sought pilots locally, there was an abundant supply. So we just couldn't understand the logic. So I just wanted to interject there. MP Karim, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now turn to the summary of recommendations. The following is a summary of the recommendations proposed by the committee for the efficient operations of Caribbean Airlines Limited. I will deal specifically with the management and staff matters. Number one, Caribbean Airlines should fill the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Executive position. And I think that it is correct to say that within the recent times, we have seen the filling of the latter position, which is the Chief Executive Officer's position. But at the position of the CFO continues to be one in which there is an acting appointment. Caribbean Airlines should follow through with plans to conduct a manpower audit to review and readjust the management structures. Caribbean Airlines should ensure that any employee continuing to be employed by the company on contract after retiring at age 60 should be paid at the base level of the position. This should be implemented with immediate effect. Caribbean Airlines should ensure that with immediate effect, any employee continuing to be employed by the company on contract after retiring at the age of 60 should have no seniority of any kind over employees below the official retirement age. And finally, in this segment, Caribbean Airlines should undertake all necessary actions over the next 6 months to complete the process of the retirement of all position holders who are over the age of 60.
Before I hand over to MP Leons, who will deal with some of the other recommendations that are on the operational matters, I want to be clear about this. Caribbean Airlines reported to this committee that they have a situation where employees, pilots in particular, are attain the age of 60. They are retired from the company. They receive their benefits, and they continue on contract until the age of 65. I think it's part of the terms of one of the collective bargaining agreements. Who negotiated that? I don't know, because here's what's inside of that agreement. You, as an employee, work until 60, and then the agreement says we must continue to pay you at the highest level where you are. So you can, and then to make it even worse, you retain seniority over people on the establishment. How could you be retired, be on contract, but retain seniority over people on the establishment? It doesn't seem to make sense, but we have the document in our records. So that was a sweetheart arrangement, a sweetheart deal that clearly benefited a particular group of employees. It goes against everything in the public service. I know many retired permanent secretaries who are very happy to get other contracts to continue working, and they certainly don't start at the highest level that they stop working at. And certainly they retain no seniority over people in the establishment. And these are the type of things that Caribbean Airlines probably didn't want to come out in the public domain. I'm sure everyone who gets that benefit is very happy for it. But for the many citizens young citizens of Shandy Bay who would love to get a job at an entry level, starting with a good company, why are we keeping people on? And hear me, I am probably approaching 60 myself. I have no problem with persons working past the age of 60. But it should not be that you effectively stop in a pipeline. That's what they're doing. They're stopping the pipeline. You're delaying the career progression of young professional, young pilots in the airline. And I want to deal with the argument that they've raised. They indicated that, well, there's a dearth of experienced pilots. Of course there's going to be a challenge, because you're keeping down the young pilots. That's what you're doing. That's what they're doing, and it's deliberate in our respectful view, or in the chairman's respectful view. And we think that as a company, you should have a national focus. And that particular recommendation, that those recommendations we've outlined, is to say, at the age of 60, you are retired from the company, you get your terminal benefits. If the company needs you, we will retain you on contract, but you cannot have seniority over people on the establishment. That just does not make sense to us. And it certainly doesn't exist in any other state enterprise that we're aware of. We will be doing our checks, don't you worry. But as far as we're currently aware, that doesn't exist. So it's a sweetheart deal, and we're recommending that practice end forthwith. I note that Mr. MP Karim noted that they have a new CEO. I know he will have a hard job trying to implement it, but he has support from this committee. So I would like now to hand over to MP Leons, who will be dealing with the recommendations on the operational matters. MP Leons.
Thank you, Chair. I'll continue specifically with operational matters. CAL should urgently conduct a route analysis with a view to a reduction and elimination of services to some North American destinations, where over the past 5 years, there have been unabated trend of declining passenger numbers and massive financial losses. This should be completed within the next 3 months, and immediate action should be taken. Regarding flight operations, CAL should be, as far as practicable, implement the recommendations contained in the Lufthansa consultant report, inclusive of replacement of the unreliable and extremely troublesome ATR aircraft. This process should begin within the next 3 months of the date of this report. CAL should commit to the refurbishment. CAL should commit to the refurbishment and modernization of its fleet. CAL should commit to the finding the root cause of the issues with the ATR aircraft. CAL should continue to adopt the key recommendations provided in the Lufthansa report, which will assist the company towards achieving profitability by 2018. Chair, I would continue with administrative matters.
Please continue, but would you permit me again?
Sure.
And because I am trying to be very detailed here, so to share, because the recommendations might, when you read them, sometimes you don't, I want to help capture the issue. Caribbean Airlines is based on the information provided to us. It's operating on some routes where every year for the past 5 years, some of those major routes, what we think that are standard routes for Caribbean Airlines, the passenger numbers are declining. And then the operating losses are increasing. So we are saying, one of the key recommendations, this is essentially a bread and butter. Your numbers, it's a bad metric for the company. It suggests that other airlines or other people are looking at other options, and your current business model needs to be adjusted significantly. Because if for 5 consecutive years on some of your marquee routes, passenger numbers are declining and the losses are increasing, then that should be more than a wake-up call, a clarion call to the management. Hey, something significant needs to happen here. And again, this is not for us to beat up on the company, but we want to make sure people understand the depth of the problem that is facing the airline. I have masses of information, and we won't put the exact numbers out there, but the losses the Caribbean Airlines have suffered on some of these routes in the past 5 years are massive, massive losses. So that we think that in our recommendation, and we've given them 3 months to treat it because we think that it deserves attention. There's no point. I think that any commercial airline, right, because I'm not sure if Caribbean Airlines comes into that, any commercial airline operating on a route and for 5 consecutive years, your numbers are declining and your losses are increasing, but probably have stopped that service long before that. Very likely. But we are sustaining a service and we're not, as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, we are paying for it. That the decision to continue paying for it is above my pay grade, but the committee can only make recommendations that the committee look at this particular issue in particular. The other issue is with the ATR aircraft, and this was stated by members of the Caribbean team on more than one occasion during the inquiry, that their views that the ATR aircraft is unreliable. The committee was particularly concerned about this on 2 facets. You have an aircraft where there were engine fire warnings in Bayakong, more than a dozen in the space of 15 to 16 months. In any other jurisdiction, an aircraft type having that type of problem would have likely been grounded by the respective civil aviation authority. The problem we have in Trinidad and Tobago in our current setup is that the civil aviation authority didn't provide any information to the traveling public about these. If you were unfortunate to be on the plane on the day when they said that we have an emergency landing, brace, that's how you knew. other than that, no one knew. And this is where we, as an entity here, we didn't understand what is the problem with providing this information to the public. So the traveling public know that there is a problem the airline is having. I would not like to be a passenger on an aircraft and the pilot announces that I have an engine fire warning and we're going to make an emergency landing. That is a serious issue. Whether there was an actual fire or not is irrelevant. There's a specific procedure the pilots have to follow to take the aircraft to the nearest airport quickly. And these are things that, based on the responses we get from CAL, we didn't get the view that they felt it was. I think there was a term used that I took particular umbrage to. When a member of senior staff could say that these were nuisance issues. I do not believe that an engine fire warning in a pressurized metal tube is a nuisance issue. I just don't get that, and I reject that argument or that position completely. And then civil aviation, because they are the authority for all aviation traffic in this country, I looked at their website. There's no record anywhere of all of these incidences. Upon request, they shared all of them with the committee. But it should not be like that. You, I, or anyone else should be able to go and find out what is the history of problems with this particular aircraft. And people might be surprised to find out how many problems there are. And it's not that it's bad. It's just about letting people know, because other airlines do it routinely. But when we operate in a way that we try to make it a secret, then people start to ascribe negative motives. Our position is make it public. We have found a fix. We've worked on a problem, and we have resolved the situation. There's no harm or shame in putting the information out there. What people get concerned about is when it becomes a secret, and then we only find out in this room here. So I think that is something that I wanted the committee members and the members of the public and the VIM to understand. So while I think the matter has been resolved, for now, we felt that the process by which they manage it could have used a lot of improvement. A lot of improvement. I will now allow MP Leons to continue with administrative matters.
Thank you, Chair. Continuing administrative matters. CAL should commit to improving its timeliness with regard to submission of administrative reports and financials. The implementation of additional features of the passenger service system will further aid CAL in improving customer service. CAL should continue to work with relevant bodies to mitigate against the risk of fraud by implementing all necessary security measures. CAL should pursue measures to recover money owed by Venezuela. CAL should maintain persistence with respect to following up with the Ministry of Finance for approval of its strategy for resolving the issues with the fare structure for Tobago Airbridge service. CAL should immediately cease the practice of annual incentive or merit payments given its current unprofitable status of the company. Consideration of reintroducing such payments in the future should be based on sustained profitability of the company and should also be subject to approval by Corporation Sole. I'd like to pass on for the continuation of administrative recommendations.
Thank you very much, MP Leons. And I think that I will continue the last bit of recommendations, largely around the pilot issues, or what we term pilot matters here. And I think that one of the issues that MP Leons, again, it's clear. I want to share the committee's view that we understand that Caribbean Airlines provides a service to Tobago, and it's an essential service, and they have to provide it. And there's a particular way in which the fare is structured. But what the committee is of the view, and the committee is very sympathetic to Caribbean Airlines on this issue, that the way in which the system is now, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago are paying a very cheap fare for what normally is the most expensive ticket in any type of airline. You buy a ticket to Tobago, and there's no restrictions. You can decide not to turn up today and turn up tomorrow and travel. Anyone traveling with any other type of airline would know that if you want to change the date there's normally something called a fee to change the date, and then there's normally something called a fare difference to travel on the day that you want to travel. What you have is a system where it clogs up the system where Caribbean Airlines sells tickets, and then persons can turn up whenever they choose to turn up, and it causes dislocation in the system. The committee is sympathetic to finding the Caribbean Airlines, going to the corporation, so Ministry of Finance, and saying, let's have a structure that mirrors its international operations. You buy a ticket to travel on November the 15th. If you don't turn up on that day, you have to call the airline and say you're not traveling. That way they can free the seat up, and then you pay some type of penalty to change to another date, nominal penalty, rather than people have tickets and just can travel whenever they decide to travel, because operationally, it's difficult for the airline to manage that. It doesn't seem to be something that will allow any entity to operate properly. And the committee is very, very sympathetic to the Caribbean Airlines on this issue, because we understand the operational challenges of that. And it's just so disconnected from the way in which airlines operate around the world. No airline really does that. If you want to have, you can purchase on any airline a completely unrestricted ticket, but it is normally the most expensive ticket that the airline would sell. You can get a ticket that you can turn up at with other major airlines and turn up at the airport and say, I want to be on this flight, but it will probably be 10 times the value of a coach ticket, a regular coach ticket. So you pay for the flexibility, where we have a situation where people get the flexibility, but pay a peppercorn rate. So there's the disconnect, and the committee is very sympathetic to Caribbean Airlines on this issue. Now I want to go into the recommendations that deal with the pilot matters. We have here the pilot focus of the airline must change to be in stakeholder focus. The extent to which the ingrained internal practices of the airline regarding seemingly preferential treatment for pilots has to end. Such practices like providing salary and other payment increases to pilots with no commensurate adjustment to other staff is demoralizing, counterproductive, and must end immediately. It's difficult to be working in an entity and you are a worker and you hear that the pilots are getting an increase and there's no increase for you. And everyone understands that piloting is a special skill. I accept that. I do enough personal travel to tell you there's a lot of faith and confidence when you sit on an aircraft. Your hands is in the hands of those controlling the aircraft. But if you're running a company, it sounds counterintuitive that these persons are the highest paid staff. You're increasing their salary, and then the other staff are getting no increase. We believe that CAL should immediately communicate to the Board of Inland Revenue regarding its likely action on CAL's failure since its inception to adhere to the regulations surrounding the benefit-in-kind taxes due to the state as it relates to the use of the cockpit jump seat by staff for personal trips. When this committee reported on that issue previously, you have a situation where pilots and it's a normal practice in the industry, pilots can use the jump seats for personal travel. The issue for us is that in Trinidad and Tobago, as far as we were advised, that type of benefit is a benefit that taxes are due and payable to the Board of Inland Revenue. But because of the pilot focus of the airline, Caribbean Airlines never even bothered to pay the taxes due to the Board of Inland Revenue. A state company couldn't be bothered. They're providing the benefit to their pilots, who can use the airline as their personal Uber to go wherever they want to go, whenever they want to go. But the little matter of paying the taxes to the state, that is not important. So that we recommended that they will be in the hands of Board of Inland Revenue in respect of any action for back taxes due from 2006 to now. I don't know what the decision is, and I don't want to prejudice the view of Board of Inland Revenue. But it's untenable that you have a state enterprise not paying the proper taxes to the state. We as a committee couldn't believe when we saw that. And and here's why it happened. Because the focus is on providing service to the pilots. And that is part of the problem. And I have no problem providing focus to the pilot, provided that the airline is profitable and we all get returns from the airline and we get an excellent service. We also, in that vein, we've recommended that CAL, depending on the decision with BIR, should take all necessary steps regarding the recovery of any taxes due to the BIR from these staff members who've used these cockpit seat privileges in an excessive manner. So once the BIR makes a determination, whatever payment is due by the airline whatever the employees share, they should make sure and collect it back from the employees. And the Board of CAL should take immediate action regarding the holding of position by persons who in many cases are woefully unqualified on the basis of CAL's stated requirements for the position. This breach of good business practice must be rectified within 6 months. This is particularly important. The committee requested Caribbean Airlines to provide us with a schedule of its senior management positions. Who are the holders, what are the experience and qualifications, and then what are the requirements of the position. We found that for a lot of positions, there was a disconnect between what Caribbean Airlines saying is required in terms of experience and qualifications as opposed to what the persons holding the positions have. And there needs to be something is wrong. And the fact that the airline is struggling to perform probably is evidence of the fact that something is wrong. And all we're saying is that they should treat with that urgently and immediately, and we've given them a 6-month time frame to deal with that. It doesn't mean that we're advocating that people lose their jobs, but it's difficult to sit in a place where we are reviewing an entity that is managing state funds, is getting state funds to keep alive, and you have persons in charge of managing those funds who are not qualified for the position. Something doesn't seem right with that, and I think we've asked the company to treat with that. We have recommended as a practice that the company introduce a mentorship program between senior pilots and junior pilots to ensure sufficient knowledge transfer takes place by the time the senior pilots attain retirement age. We recognize that the whole issue of succession planning is a problem within Caribbean Airlines. They don't seem to be properly planning for succession, which is why you end up with persons arriving at 60 and then, wow, well, we absolutely need that person, can't do without them, because we found that there were several other persons or parties and employees who are attained the age of 60 in all types of positions, from upholsterer come up, who seemed to be absolutely necessary, the company couldn't do without. And it's because they didn't do the proper succession planning. Next recommendation is that CAL should apply a new process to manage the use of jump seat for personal use. And I want to stress personal use. The committee understands that pilots using the jump seat to move from one station to another to do company business is fine. But we are saying that for all personal use, such staff members must be liable to pay the relevant taxes associated with the flight sectors involved. And this should be implemented with immediate effect. So we have no problem with persons continuing to use it for personal use in this way. But if they're using it, they should be liable for the taxes that are due. Other employees who get rebated travel have to pay the taxes before they can travel. That's just how it works. The pilot should not be given any special treatment in that respect, in our humble view. We only have a couple more recommendations. Don't worry, don't panic. We believe that the first 20, our next recommendation is that the first 20 of the jump seat uses by pilots for personal reasons, must be deducted from that employee's annual allotment of 20 free travel passes. Thereafter, for pilots only, there will be a limit of up to 20 additional personal jump seat trips allowed per year. This should be implemented with immediate effect. And the reason the committee is recommending this is because there's been a pattern of abuse or overuse. We requested from the company a schedule showing how many jump seats for trips were taken by pilots for personal use. And as we reported previously, there was more than one individual who ran up very high numbers. We couldn't understand how could one man make 100 free jump seat personal trips a year. 100. I mean, when do you work? So something is wrong. So we're recommending put a cap on it. Put a cap on it and say that if you want to use it, you have 20 uses per year. Because at this stage, it's virtually Peter Pan for Paul, but because there was no regulation around it, people have allowed it to flow very freely. And we're suggesting put a cap on it and put some rigor on it. And the final recommendation we have for Caribbean Airlines is that the airline should immediately cease all efforts regarding its international recruitment of foreign pilots, given its own stated position about the number of local pilots who have been seeking jobs. And we believe that we would always say that this is a recommendation. There may always be instances where the company may wish to deviate, but the general policy is that you should seek local pilots first, rather than be advertising internationally to come fly in the sunny Caribbean. When we have a situation where the committee is well aware, there's quite a lot of pilots who are qualified in Trinidad and Tobago cannot get a job with Caribbean Airlines, despite multiple attempts at applying. So something doesn't seem to be right. So this brings us to the end of the recommendations in terms of all of the reports that we've laid before. I want to say that I want to express the committee's gratitude to all the stakeholders that provided both oral and written evidence to the committee. And the committee wishes to say a special thanks to those patriots of Trinidad and Tobago, especially some of those working at Caribbean Airlines, who provided additional information to the company to help provide us with a fuller picture of some of the challenges that the airline is facing. To the committee, forgive me, to the committee. Because we believe that while we are in a position where we request information, the experience of the committee with Caribbean Airlines in particular is sometimes that the information we requested, we may not have gotten the fullest picture when we requested information. And our experience in one notable incident is when we got a document this big as the document we requested, when we asked Caribbean Airlines, could you certify in writing that what you sent is a complete document? We eventually got a document this big. Yeah, and that's the reality of what we dealt with. So we want to thank all of those who helped us to understand that while what we got was this, there was actually a larger document. So the committee wishes to thank those patriots, the right-thinking citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, who have a vested interest in seeing all of our state entities prosper, thrive, and deliver service and profits to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So at this stage, we're complete, and I hand over to Atiba. Questions? Yeah. And we're available to take questions on all of these reports from any member of the panel. Feel free.
For the members of the media wishing to ask questions, we just ask that when you do, please state your name and give us what media house you represent.
Shaliza Hassan Ali from the Trinidad Guardian. Mr. Mark, you described many of the state enterprises as a rogue element. Can you expound on that, what you mean by rogue?
What we have discovered based on our analysis arising out of our inquiry is that in several instances, these state enterprises would engage in borrowings without the approval of the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance is the ultimate individual under our system to sign off. But there would be instances where these state enterprises, according to our inquiry, would be doing literally their own thing. And afterwards, the entity that is responsible for granting approval would be made aware of the activity or the engagement. And this is a matter that we believe is extremely serious. We also discovered, as I said earlier, that many of them have strayed from the state enterprises performance manual in terms of what they were supposed to be doing as it relates to guidelines before they embark upon certain decisions and actions. And as the chairman said, it's a very comprehensive state enterprises performance manual. And if it is followed properly, many of these state entities would not end up being or operating almost in violation or in breach of some of the guidelines of the State Enterprises Performance Manual. And that is why we have recommended that this manual be translated into a binding and legal document with appropriate penalties in place to deal with those enterprises that violate or breach these particular guidelines that have been outlined in the State Enterprises Manual.
I want to follow up, because being rogue applies even to Caribbean Airlines. When this committee questioned them on the purchase of the ATR, could you provide the tender documents and all the reviews if you're purchasing an aircraft? Our logic was you would put out a request for proposals, you would get those requests for proposals, you would review them, you would have a committee have a report on whoever proposed offers of aircraft, and then you would have a recommendation. What was provided to us was woefully short of that. They spent several $100 million on aircraft, and comprehensive documentation on the approval or even the process that was used, we are yet to receive because they struggle to find it. So when you look at the State Enterprises Performance Monitoring Manual, there's a clear procedure for tendering. They didn't follow it. Now, I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm sharing with you what transpired, or when we asked the question, we found that the responses coming back to us, we asked this and they went all the way around because they seem to be struggling because either the documentation didn't exist or the process that was followed is a process they didn't want to talk about. We didn't know. So that was an issue that we didn't have a recommendation on because we were unsure what transpired there. When you have an entity spending several $100 million of taxpayers' money and they can't tell us definitively what was the process used, where's the tender documents, where's the recommendation report, they provided some information showing what one of the providers provided a presentation. But a presentation from the provider doesn't help us. We want your documentation, your process. And they were not able to provide it. I see MP carry motion to jump.
Mr. Chairman, let me also add that when we examined Caribbean Airlines Limited, you would note from the first general findings that I read out, that one of the concerns expressed therein was the fact that CAL was not adhering to the timely submission of its reports to the line ministry, the Ministry of Finance. And therefore, that would have presented a challenge in terms of effective and efficient decision-making.
Ms. Mark, this is just a follow-up question. You spoke about state enterprises who violate the rules should pay a penalty. Can you say what that penalty should be?
We have not drilled down into the nature or character of the penalties. What we have submitted to the Parliament is the need, first of all, once the Parliament accepts the recommendation of this committee through the ministry in question, Ministry of Finance, to translate the State Enterprises Performance Manual into a legal document, then obviously what it would need is a meeting of the minds in order to determine, among other things, whenever any provisions in that manual is violated, is breached, what should be the accompanying penalties or sanctions. I think it would be a bit premature for any one of us to come out specifically with any kind of recommendation at this stage, because we have made a broad recommendation, and once it is accepted, we will be prepared to meet with the Ministry of Finance, and I'm sure the Ministry of Finance will meet with other entities through the Office of the Attorney General once that decision is effected and the document is translated into a legal document, which would include the appropriate penalties that should be attached to each provision whenever those provisions have been violated. But I can't give you any specific idea as to what the penalties should be. It would be speculative, and the committee has not discussed that matter, and therefore I would be premature in making such a submission.
Good morning, Gisha Kaulesa, Guardian newspaper. You said Cal is being owed a huge sum of money by Venezuela. Can we get the figure, please?
That is part of the commercial operations of the airline, and as we given the mandate of the committee, we try to protect the companies. You notice I would have quoted numbers and said losses were large, but I didn't quote the actual figure. What we try to do is not to damage the commercial operations of the companies, but they're owed quite a tidy sum, and I think that what's interesting is that the Venezuela operation, or the Caracas flight, is probably one of their more profitable routes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And regarding the North American routes that aren't viable, is it possible to identify particular routes?
I wouldn't like to identify particular routes, but I could safely say that the majority of routes are not generating operating profits. And this is not a last year, 1 year phenomenon. It's a phenomenon for the past, based on the information we have for the past 5 years. The operating profits, in fact, well, the routes are doing, the vast majority of them are turning operating losses. And in a situation where your passenger numbers are declining. If you're running a business and the number of persons patronizing you is going down and your losses are going up, it in a whole respectful way, demands urgent attention. I'm not sure exactly what strategies they can employ, but it requires urgent attention, because I think that Caribbean Airlines is struggling, in my own view, because the business model has changed. And they're still operating with a business model that doesn't apply in the current circumstances, where airlines such as some of their competitors don't offer things that probably Caribbean Airlines offer. So I think it's fine. We leave it up to the management to try to see how they can navigate out of that situation.
And one final thing, regarding recommendations put forward to CAL, is the committee giving the entity a particular time frame in which to adhere to some of these recommendations?
Yes, we would have outlined several of the recommendations had a specific time frame. You would have a copy of the document, and some of the recommendations have specific time frames to treat with at least our recommendation, and we're suggesting. Some of those issues around, particularly the staff issues, we understand that you can't just move staff out today for tomorrow, but you need to engage the process, and you need to start the process. So we've given some time frames, and we're expecting that the companies will look at it and try to see how best they can figure out how to manage going forward.
Chair,
so MP Leon.
Specific to the North American routes, we have given a recommendation for a 3-month timeline for this study and analysis to be completed.
With respect to the retirement, some of those recommendations are immediate.
It's all listed within the documentation there, because we feel that some of those we put immediate require a management decision that doesn't cause immediate dislocation, so that you can there's no, in our respectful view or in the committee's view, there's no significant impediment to putting it in place immediately. Some others require additional time, as MP Leons, who said, a complete route analysis to understand what is happening to your routes. We feel that is one of the biggest problems at the airline. It needs urgent attention. Stop and look at this and try to figure out what we can do to turn this around. And it needs to be done very, very quickly. Otherwise, we'll run into another year of losses and be continuing along a dangerous path for the company.
Senator Mark, I just wanted to find out, you said Trinidad and Tobago is inching its way to a $100 billion debt, 44 which was incurred by state enterprises. Can you give a breakdown of the 54 million, the other 54 million?
No, that is not, I cannot give you that breakdown now, but I'm saying if you look at the review of the economy or any central bank reports, you will see exactly, or the Auditor General submission on the accounts of Trinidad and Tobago. In those documents, you'll see an outline of the, or breakdown of the amount of monies that are owed, by whom that would amount to. I think the specific number, if I'm not mistaken, is just around 93 billion at this time as we speak. And I'm saying we are inching very quickly towards the 100 mark in Trinidad and Tobago. But I can't give you at this time, because that is not part of our mandate. Our mandate is with state enterprises, and that is what I can deal with. Maybe at another time, I can provide you that information.
Chair, can you say which state enterprise is most worrying to you in terms of its debt ratio?
The largest numbers are obviously attached to some of the bigger state enterprises. I think that Petrotrin is one of the companies that has a large debt, and it requires special attention. I think Petrotrin is an entity that, because of its long history and the troublesome history it's had, there still resides within Petrotrin tremendous value to Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that given that the current focus of, I understand the Minister of Finance is looking in particular in terms of helping them manage the bullet payment that's due, I think, next year. Because Petrotrin, while it's been saddled with debt, and I don't want to go down the history of how we got there. Our style is, listen, this is where we are. How do we try to fix it? And I believe that Petrotrin's debt is one that that's something that could be fixed, but needs special attention. It's one of those that is the biggest debt. But we received a spreadsheet, and you would be, and from medium to small, there's quite a large number of entities that have contracted quite a bit of debt. And you try to, our biggest struggle was that we have no challenge or no problem with an entity engaging in debt for something where we can see tangible benefits, and there's a rationale. But in many instances, as Senator Mark indicated, they may have gone outside of the wonderful schedule of, in the way as outlined in the manual about, if you want to do that, you should provide a rationale, you should have a strategic plan to help us understand how is this going to fit in to the company's operations. Otherwise, you're incurring debt. And so...
But Chair, it's mind-boggling that a lot of these state enterprises, they were working without a strategic plan. How that came about?
Well, let me say, a lot of them would have had an outdated strategic plan. It would not have been updated. So you would find yourself in 2016 or 2017 with a strategic plan going up to 2014 or 2015. And critically, what this company, every time we have an inquiry into an entity, if they don't have a current strategic plan, even if they do, we ask, what was achieved under the previous plan? Did you meet your objectives? Because there's no point having a strategic plan and having it in a file folder or sending it to the parliamentarian as a nice copy of a nice bound document. It looks wonderful. And then the things that you were supposed to achieve, there should be some reckoning or some accounting of what was supposed to be achieved and what it is you actually arrived at.
Chair, can you say which state enterprise was unable to pay its debt?
I don't have that detail in front of me right now, but the committee, I'm sure we can find a way to provide some of that information to you. We have quite a bit of people on all of these entities. They would fill up the room, literally.
Good morning, Janine Brown, CNMG. Chairman, you raised the concern on travel of pilots abusing their travel privileges. Did the committee unearth any abuse of, say, regular employees or their family, any abuse of traveling privileges where that is concerned?
The committee did inquire about that, and based on the responses provided by Caribbean Airlines, I would say that it's not prevalent. It's not a major issue within the airline in terms of the staff, regular staff, members of staff, and I should probably not use that word regular, but members of staff of the airline, aside from pilots, are allowed 20 rebated travel tickets per year. And that was a specific question that we asked, and whether there was any abuse, and it was insignificant. So that there seemed to be no significant abuse by members of staff of that particular travel privilege. And so your question is, aside from the pilots, so we understand where the problem lies. When the committee looked at this issue, when you looked at Caribbean Airlines wages and salaries bill, you have pilots representing probably about 10 to 15%, if I'm not wrong, somewhere around there. I don't have the exact number. 10 to 15% of the total number of persons employed by the company. But they represent almost 1/2 of the wages and salaries bill. So something is wrong with that. When we did the tremendous support team of the parliament here, we asked them to go and try to understand what obtains in other airlines around the world. What is the spread? And we found that Caribbean Airlines is way out there. 45% of your wages and salaries being paid to pilots. That doesn't exist in other significant airlines around the world. And we're saying that there needs to be some type of review, because I'm not saying you have to be perfect, but if you find yourself you're effectively an outlier, then it requires attention. And that's all the company is saying, it requires attention. I will never advocate for persons to have their salaries reduced. But here we are. It's a state enterprise. Your tax dollars, every single person in this room, your tax dollars is funding that operation, so that we have a say. And I, as a taxpayer, I would like to have a say that I have no problem with people earning, but given the performance is poor. And if you're earning way out and above what applies in other entities, then it requires someone to go in there and say, perhaps something is wrong here, let's look at the system and see if we could fix it.
Just
put on your mic. Yeah.
Would you give Caribbean Airlines a failing grade?
I have never marked papers in my life, so I don't know about failing grades. Caribbean Airlines can be fixed. Okay. I think that there's a history of management failure, a history of management not being able to understand their responsibility properly. And there's been a lot of self-service inside of the airline. They provide good service to self in many instances, in particular the pilots. But sometimes the focus should be service to the stakeholders, your shareholder, and the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And you should be doing it in a way that generates a sustained level of profitable performance. Yeah? MP Karim?
Let me just indicate that what we found is that there was strong brand loyalty to Caribbean Airlines, and we indicated that that can be utilized effectively for improving its operations and its profitability.
Chair, if I may add, and the function of this committee is not to pass or to fail entities. It's basically to understand the deficiencies and give recommendations to promote for improvement. CAL is an entity that we are all proud of, and we want to see it working well.
Chair, Mr. Marks said that funds were borrowed without proper approval. I'm talking about the state enterprises. Was there a lack of oversight in these ministries?
We are still struggling with that as a committee. You find, again, this goes back to our recommendation about the performance monitoring manual. There's a specific procedure laid out, and yet entities will seem to have been able to borrow without following all of the procedures. That it should not have happened. No, exactly where the fault lies, this committee is not in a position to opine on that in any significant way. But what we are saying in our recommendation, because remember, this committee is here to try to fix or recommend ways in which we could improve the system. What we are saying is we reviewed the recommendations and the way in which it is supposed to happen in the performance monitoring manual, and we are saying if you follow that manual exactly, the instances of issues that you've just described would be very, very small, if any at all. So that is key, because if we have rules and procedures and people or entities are allowed to choose when to use the rules or which parts of the rule to use, then it's almost of no use. Yeah? So, and the committee feels very strongly that we should have a way in which the performance probably needs updating in some areas, but this performance monitoring manual has to be binding in some way, that as a state entity in charge of state resources, people, money, and capital and of all types, you should be bound to the state enterprises performance monitoring manual. And that applies across whether it's Caribbean Airlines, VIMCOT, or any other entity.
Chair, how would you describe the... Okay.
One of the key recommendations is that the investment division in the Ministry of Finance be staffed properly and the staff be increased. That would assist in terms of monitoring the state enterprises.
My last question, Chair. How would you describe the $44 billion debt that was unearthed or discovered by the Joint Select Committee? Was it very worrying, a concern to you all, alarming?
We asked the question different than how you asked it. We asked the question of the representatives of the Ministry of Finance. In the terms of the history of how the debt portfolio for state enterprises has performed or looked over the previous years, whether 44 billion was a high number, or was it a normal number, or was it a low number? I think the response we got back along the lines that 44 billion is probably about the highest it's ever been. So from where we sit, we're not sure if to be alarmed or otherwise, but at least from the Ministry of Finance team, I recall, they said that right now where it's at, it's probably at the highest level it's ever been, just around. So we're pushing now at the limit of, or at least not the limit, forgive me, we're at a stage where the number is a number that is within the recent history, this is the highest. Where it could go or where it should go is out of the, not within the purview of this committee.
May I say that under Standing Orders 100, subsection 6, and that of the Senate, and 110, subsection 6 of the House of Representatives, when reports of the nature that we are discussing are tabled, and these reports have all been tabled in the Parliament, the minister with responsibility, I'm quoting from the standing orders, the minister responsible for the ministry or body under review shall, not me, shall, not later than 60 days after a report from a standing committee relating to the ministry or body has been laid upon the table, present a paper to the House responding to any recommendations or comments contained in the report, which are addressed to it. So this is saying that once these reports are tabled, the minister with responsibility for that entity or those entities, in this instance the Minister of Finance, has a maximum, he can submit before, but he has a maximum of 60 days within which to tender to the Parliament and to this committee through the Parliament its views, his ministry's views on the recommendations and how they are going to implement those recommendations. Then the committee will have to set up some little team to monitor how those recommendations are being implemented. So I just wanted to emphasize that there's a deadline for those ministries and the minister in charge of those ministries to respond. A second point I just wanted to raise in closing. I am also chairman of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, and I'm happy to note a recommendation here, because I recall some time ago we had an entity before us, and that entity had gone out on the open market and raised $1.2 billion. And that entity indicated to the population and to our committee that they did not require the approval of the Minister of Finance. And I'm very happy to know that one of the recommendations that we are making here under the State Enterprises, JSC, is that approval must be had by the Minister of Finance. And that is why we are also emphasizing that this State Enterprises Performance Manual become a legal document with appropriate penalties attached. Because with an entity borrowing $1.2 billion and telling the Parliament and the people of TNT they don't need the Minister of Finance approval, that is alarming. And that is worrying. Because at any rate, if that entity fails to meet its obligations to that bank that they borrow that money from, trust me, it is the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago that will have to fill that breach. And that is why it's important that when they go out there to borrow money, they must have the approval of the Minister of Finance.
As we begin to wrap up, the committee wishes to state also, there's a question that comes to this committee all the time. I suppose it comes to other committees. Well, after you've done all of these inquiries and done all of these hearings and you have all of these lovely recommendations, what's next? Senator Marcus alluded to a process where the ministry responsible has 60 days to respond back to us on where they are. This committee is in the process. We did several reports last year on the National Gas Company, VIMCOT, and Petrotrin. We understand that all of these entities are operating entities and they have business as usual and they have our recommendations to deal with. But we also recognize that we have a duty to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, that when we sit here and we do public inquiries and we come up with recommendations, that there's action taking place on them. So we are giving what we consider to be a reasonable amount of time based on the updates we received, and the committee reserves its rights, depending on what the reports come back on the status of the implementation of these recommendations, to bring those entities back to find out, okay, we've done the inquiry, we've provided certain recommendations, we've seen your report on the status of where they are. Come and report to the people of Trinidad and Tobago on why you have or have not dealt with these specific recommendations. The committee is reserving that right. Because the committee is of the view that if you relax, then what you will find is that entities will just stick your recommendations in a folder and leave it there and forget about it. We are not about that, because a lot of effort, personal time and effort of the committee members and the support team here at the Parliament have went into this, and a lot of analysis has been done. And we think that a lot of these recommendations are actionable. So we will not be sitting by casual observers to the process going forward. I give you that assurance as the chairman of this committee, that this committee will be working very hard to make sure that those entities to whom we've reported on, and we have provided recommendations, that we understand very clearly from them where they are. And if at any point in time we are not satisfied, they will be back in this room to answer one question: why have you not implemented recommendations? I don't think any one of them will be looking forward to that, but that is what is in the pipeline if we are not satisfied with the way in which you've responded to the committee, because we take this work very seriously. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. Good. Well, it's a pleasure having you all. I want to thank again the members of the media who've come here today, the members of the viewing, listening, and streaming members who are on streaming media. Thank you for your attention. I want to thank especially the support team to this committee. We have a stellar support team who've done a lot of the analysis, helped us to, every time we get a whole bunch of documents, they've condensed those documents into readable format. They've crunched the financial numbers, done the ratio analysis. There's a lot of work that goes behind the work of the committee to support us in us being able to do the work that we do here. And we want to, as a committee, we want to thank them for the stellar work that they're doing. And with that, I would like to say that this session, can I close the session, Atiba? Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Wilshire has given me the authority to thank you very much and to say that this session is now adjourned. Thank you very much.